Yes.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started then, and we'll start with prayer.
All right.
Lord, we thank you for the day, and we thank you for your blessings for each one of us. We ask, Lord, that you comfort us in our own grief, but also that you help us as we learn to deal with others' grief too, to be the kind of people that have compassion and care and kindness as we help others to cope with the grief that they go through. So help us in that, Father, to be good representatives for you in our ministry. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So tonight I want to start by just saying that there are times in a person's grief journey when um, the recovery from a loss can be disturbed for some reason. It can be slowed down, it can be stopped at a point where they just seem to continue to grieve for years. They go through what we term unresolved grief. We're going to explore some reasons for that this evening. Some forms of unresolved grief that I'm going to talk about briefly anyway. One of them is just when grief is completely absent. And that does happen sometimes. I had a gentleman not too long ago, and he's fairly young. He's in his 50s. His wife was in her late 40s. And she passed away from uterine cancer, I believe it was. And it was like he didn't grieve at all. And it wasn't that he didn't love her or care for her. He just refused to allow himself to go into grief. He did have 3 small children, and so he felt like he had to be strong for them, and he just would not admit that he had any grief at all, at least when we were face to face and others were face to face with him. It was like there was nothing there. And that's not a healthy thing at all. It's almost as though the loss never happened, and they try to go on living life day to day as if nothing ever happened, with minimal signs of grief, sometimes with no signs of grief at all. This is usually a person who is aware of their grief, but they attempt to minimize the feelings as much as possible. And they may go out of their way to prove that they're not really impacted by the loss. Sometimes they often believe that grief is something that's to be quickly thought through and dismissed, but not felt. Personally, I don't understand that kind of grief because I feel loss, as most people do, but some people try not to acknowledge that there's any loss at all. Any feelings of grief are threatening to this person, and they're seeking to avoid pain at any cost. Internally, however, many times that repressed grief continues to build and results in a lot of emotional strain and tension further down the line as they go through that. Have any of you ever known anyone that was that way?
I personally do not know of anybody that have gone through that, but my neighbor's sister lost her husband of 25 years. He's always had heart problems.
Mhm.
And she just, well, maybe that is similar to that. I'm not sure. Well, she just didn't grieve. She just wouldn't accept it to the
Right.
point that she just shut down. She didn't clean the house. She didn't go back to work. It got to the point that her sister had to go over and help her, sort out the bills, and because he did everything for her.
Right.
Finally, but the short version of the story is they put her in a nursing home. So she is not functional at all. She's living, but she checked out.
Yes, that is another type. It is similar to this, but not quite exactly the same thing. We'll talk about that one too in a little bit as well. Another form of grief, unresolved grief, is inhibited grief. Now, this is just when someone represses some of the normal grief responses. Sometimes the grieving person can only grieve over certain aspects of their loss, but not necessarily of the person themselves. Other symptoms, sometimes psychosomatic complaints, may substitute for normal grief. Some of the more common ones include having stomach aches, headaches, a loss of energy, and they convert their feelings of grief into physical symptoms that hide their real grief, and they try to get their emotional needs met through those physical ailments instead of allowing people to meet the emotional need they have to actually grieve. So they can't put that grief off on the person who's died. So they kind of take it upon themselves, and they have these physical symptoms that allow people then to sympathize with them and to help them through those times. That's an attempt to get their real emotions to be nurtured and comforted by people around them, met instead of by grief, but by physical problems instead. Another kind of unresolved grief is delayed grief. Sometimes grief can be postponed for months or even years. That can be caused by an overload of pressing responsibilities, like the man with the young children, or just because they don't feel like they can deal with their grief right now. And that does happen too. The underlying thought with this person is that if they put it off, maybe it'll go away. Obviously, it doesn't, and it can't. And so the grief builds, and often then a future loss triggers an avalanche of emotions that can completely incapacitate a person. And that makes that person is unaware that it's really only through the expression of genuine grief that healing can truly come. There is another form of unresolved grief that's called grief displacement. This is the person who takes the expression of grief away from the actual loss and channels their feelings in other directions. That direction, they might complain about work problems or relationship problems that they're having with somebody, someone in the family or at work or a friend. Or they might become upset over pretty minor events. This individual often becomes a bitter person in general, for whom nothing about their life is ever good anymore. And others in this situation might turn inward, becoming full of self-hatred and chronic depression. The purpose of displacement is to shift the grief away from the actual source of the grief and on to less threatening people or situations. It's just another way not to deal with the grief that's happening to them right now. Another one, another form of unresolved grief is called chronic grief. This is fairly common. This occurs when the person continues showing grief responses that were appropriate in the early days of grieving, but are inappropriate years later. The mourning just doesn't proceed to any signs of closure. They just don't seem to be able to reach a point of closure. And this is especially common in the loss of a person with whom the mourner had a very intense relationship. Some might say a codependent relationship in which they had a great emotional investment in that codependency. Another form of unresolved grief is abbreviated grief. There are several reasons that a grief timeline can become abbreviated. Sometimes the grieving person immediately replaces what was lost. So you might find someone who's lost a spouse finding a new relationship within just a few weeks, something to replace the relationship they had and that they needed. So their grief was very abbreviated because they were seeking someone new to replace that grief. This can also happen with the loss of jobs or the loss of, through a divorce or something like that as well. We actually see it more there than we do in death, but it does happen in death as well. So the person takes the emotions that were invested in the relationship in which the person has died, and they prematurely invested into another relationship. They're not really aware that this is really just a means of avoiding facing and resolving their grief. There's an assumption by observers that this person must not have loved the person who died very much. And instead of confronting their pain, they replace the attachment with another person, or even with overwork, or plunging frantically into a hobby, for instance, doing something to occupy their time so they don't have to think about the true emotions of grief. So that's another way too. Or perhaps there wasn't much attachment to what was lost in the first place. Or in the case of the terminally ill, sometimes much of the grieving had already occurred in advance of the death. And that's something else that can happen too, quite often. So some of the characteristics of unresolved grief then that we see most commonly from day to day is the absence of a normal grief reaction, or a lingering reaction, a distortion of the normal grief reaction, sometimes guilt, self-blame, panic attacks, feelings of choking and fear, physical symptoms similar to those of the deceased person's terminal illness. This is something that we see quite often in hospice, is that when someone has had a terminal long-term illness, once they pass away, others that were close to them in the family begin to over-identify with that disease and fear that they may be suffering from the same thing, and therefore they're going to also pass away soon. Sometimes another characteristic of unresolved grief is an enshrinement or an unwillingness to remove the belongings of a deceased person, even after a reasonable amount of time. That's not something they want to go through immediately. They don't want to just take their husband's clothes out of the closet and donate them to Goodwill necessarily immediately, but they sometimes call this mummification, where they will leave a room in the house totally dedicated to that person and they never change it for years and years. That is also a sign of unresolved grief. Another sign of that is extensively thinking about and noticing themes centering around the loss of life. So they become almost obsessed with death, with dying, with loss itself. Sometimes minor losses will trigger major grief reactions. That's another characteristic of unresolved grief. Sometimes they develop phobias around death and illnesses. Sometimes they begin to exclude anyone or anything that used to be associated with the deceased person. And at other times, there may be a compulsion to imitate the deceased person due to over-identification with them. And so they begin to imitate their thoughts, their behaviors, just to imitate them as if they were still living. When a person has one or more of these symptoms, and it continues for 6 months to a year, then they likely have unresolved grief that has to be worked through. Any questions about that or any comments, thoughts? Have you noticed this in anyone before or maybe even in yourselves?
When my mother passed away, she had come to live with us and she was only here about 3.5 months. But I can remember Paul and I were talking about, storage in the house. And he made a comment to me. He said, well, if you would move all of your mother's things out of that front closet, we'd have a lot more room. And he said it kindly. And I just snapped at him. I said, don't you dare touch my mother's things. I said, when I'm ready to do it, I'll let you know. And it was about almost 2 years. And I would do it gradually. I would remove a few of her clothes at a time, and then a
Yes.
few more. And I kept one blouse. I don't know if I still have it or not, but I kept that one blouse just because I knew how she loved clothes and she always looked so nice. She dressed so nice. And I don't know, I just felt like I needed to hold on to that.
Yeah.
So, that was probably a little example of that. I just really couldn't let go.
Yes, but you eventually did. And, just
Yes.
the fact that you began to eventually give those things away and process through that grief was a good response. For most people, that could have taken place a little earlier, but not everybody grieves in the same way.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Mary, were you going to add something in there too? Okay. For a minute, I want to talk also about some of the differences between depression and just mourning or grieving someone. Sometimes we feel like that a person that's going through a normal grief reaction is actually depressed, when in fact they may not actually be depressed. So there is a difference between depression and grieving. And we want to talk about that a little bit. Depression is something that we're all familiar with. We may not fully understand it because depression takes on many different symptoms and characteristics from person to person. And it's a common grief response. I mean, in the beginning of grief, we do suffer through some depression, but there is a difference between grief and clinical depression. Now, if a person has struggled with depression before a death, that even complicates it more But how do you determine how much of it is true grief and how much of it is a carryover from previous affliction of depression? So grief and depression are certainly not the same things. And here are some guidelines to remember about that. Depression seems to have a life of its own, apart from grief. Its symptoms exist regardless of the day-to-day events or triggers that might happen. Depression is something that remains constant, even in the absence of triggers. So if there had not been a grief reaction at all, would this person still have been depressed? So that's something to think about. That's one of the guidelines to remember. Signs of depression also, if they persist past about 2 months' time, that is also an indication that it may not be occurring as a reaction to the loss. So if they are suffering through a deep depression, it may be that it's not caused by the grief if it lasts for a long time, or longer than about 2 months. It's what psychologists believe. Another guideline to remember is that a person in grief is more likely to believe that their depression is normal and it will lift given a little bit of time. And so that's a sign that they're not truly going through depression. They are having a period of depression, but they're not chronically depressed. Grief doesn't generally bring a persistent and severe, distorted, negative perception of a person's self or about their life in general. So if they have this persistent and long-term perception that they are a negative self-perception over a long period of time, that's not grief. That is truly depression. Depression that comes with grief is usually the agitated, restless type. It tends to come and go, and it occurs earlier in the period of grief rather than later on. And guilt in grief is usually focused on a specific aspect of the loss. Depression expresses an overall sense of guilt and is preoccupied with what a person has done wrong and how worthless he is. And so that's something else to watch out for as you think about a person going through grief or a person who's really suffering through depression. A depressed person will have a long-term preoccupation with how bad they are, how worthless they are, things like that. A person in grief may have bouts of that, but it won't last for an extended period of time. In uncomplicated mourning or in uncomplicated grief, suicidal intent is very rare. We don't run across that very often. Not so with clinical depression. With grief, there's usually a healthy mourning, a healthy grieving as the loss is acknowledged. But in depression, many times the person really doesn't grieve at all. They may exhibit some characteristics of grief, but they quite possibly may not be truly grieving. They may just be going through a deeper depression. It may deepen their depression even more. And for people who are already clinically depressed, that kind of death and grief may throw them into a suicidal intent. And that's something that we as clinicians in hospice and other things have to continually watch for, is to see if this grief throws someone closer to suicide and attempting suicide. I remember quite a few years ago having a man whose wife was dying from cancer. She never told him about her diagnosis, and he never truly figured it out until she passed away. And then he was told what she had. And we had to watch him very closely for a long time because of his depression over that. So sometimes that does happen. With grief, pain is a part of the loss, and the grieving person accepts that. But someone who is depressed doesn't always see the value in pain, and they may wish to relieve their pain through suicide or through other means. And so that's another difference between a grief-stricken person and a depressed person. In grief, in someone who is grieving appropriately, you're likely to notice some anger. Absolutely. We do get angry about death, as we talked in some of the earlier sessions. But that's not true with depression. As a matter of fact, in grief, there's going to be a wide range of emotions that people go through, a wide range of activities that they engage in. That's usually not the case with depression. A depressed person usually does not show as much emotion as someone who is going through grief. At least their emotion is not as up and down as someone that's in grief. They just seem to have a level amount of depression that afflicts them. In grief, at least in the beginning of grief, there is a preoccupation with the deceased person. With depression, there is more of a preoccupation with me, not with the person who's passed away. So they're more preoccupied with what's happening to them and thinking more about what's happening to them and the grief that they're experiencing or what they're experiencing, rather than thinking so much about the other person. Two final differences I want to talk about too in this area is that a person who is grieving appropriately, they will often respond in healthy and constructive ways when they are shown warmth and support and encouragement. Someone who is going through a deep clinical depression many times cannot respond to that at all. All they can do is blame themselves or focus on themselves and their worthlessness and their guilt and their pain, rather than responding in a healthy way to good, strong encouragement and support. Also, those who are grieving appropriately respond in a way that leads others to respond with sympathy and concern. A depressed person, on the other hand, frequently causes other people to respond with irritation and frustration and a desire to avoid them. And that's something else that that can kind of give you a clue as to whether this person is truly grieving or if they are just simply depressed. So, thoughts or questions about any of that? Comments?
I just have a question. If a person end up going to prison, where this lady, her son went to prison, and she didn't want to get rid of his clothing, Is that grieving, because he's alive, but he's going to be gone for a while, and someone had tried to talk her into giving his clothes away, and she got really upset about it. And to this day, I don't know whether she did or not, because he got a lot of time away in prison. Is that part of grieving?
Absolutely. For someone to be incarcerated is not just, it's not a grief that's just for the person who's incarcerated, although I'm sure they have grief over what they've done, or, I would assume that may not be correct, but I think it probably would be in many cases. But it is certainly a grief for the person who is left behind, like this mother, or a wife, or even a child. Because they are separated from that person, there is definitely grief involved.
This is Jacqueline. I want to comment on that part as well because um, I watched a family member, my youngest grandson, he got murdered, and my
Mhm.
daughter, she showed different signs of the grief, like the anger, the guilt, and it was like not just for herself, but blaming others.
Mhm.
Well, even for myself, like I can't look at his pictures. I don't have none of his pictures up because I haven't clearly, just gotten past all of it. But I know that it don't go away right away, and it takes some time. And this is one of the classes I kept because it really is important in order for me to get bypass that and grow spiritually to be able to support someone else. You can, and it's like you can help other people, but for some reason it's hard to help you family members. Seem like they reject more than a stranger will.
That is very true. As Jesus said, a prophet is without honor in his own country. Uh,
Right.
so that is very true. For your family, sometimes you're the worst person, the one person they don't want to listen to, even if you are a voice of reason. But to have that anger over a murder that's happened within a family, to have a sense of guilt and anger over that is a very natural response, I would think.
Right. Right.
Now, if that anger were to continue for years, on a fairly consistent level, that might need to be dealt with by a counselor or a professional.
Well,
Even then, it can come, it can rise and fall over time.
right, but it come and go. It's like it don't take much for it to show. Like
Yes,
one minute, it's one way, and then here goes something, and it just triggers it off. It just triggers it off, and um, I pray for it because I a lot have happened when it comes to us losing family members. Like I said before, 3 people in one day, 7 in a week. Just
yes,
it's just been really amazing to have to experience that, kind of thing. And I've been, like I said, I just been praying for and whatever. And, it's not like I didn't teach my kids the word of God, but I knew once they get older, it was up to them to receive and accept and have a relationship with God on their own.
yes,
But I think it made it easier by introducing them and making sure they seen it in me, not just talk about it, but be about it. Like, you know,
absolutely.
nobody's perfect at the end of the day. And it's sad because just because you see a person might go through something or do something, the flesh is still weak and we will fall sometime. It's the thing of getting up from whatever it is.
Yes, absolutely. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions about all of this? All right. I want to talk about something else too that we run into a lot of times, but that has some characteristics about what Cheryl was talking about with the clothes in the closet, things like that.
Mhm.
It's possible that you've never heard about linking objects.
Linking objects.
Linking, yeah, as in putting two objects together. But this can partly be responsible for a person not moving forward to resolve their grief in a healthy manner too. So
Right.
we
Yeah.
do want to talk about this a little bit. A linking object is a symbolic object that the person keeps that provides a way through which the relationship can be continued, usually in an unhealthy way. The grieving person invests some object with a symbolism that establishes a link between them and the deceased.
Yeah.
And it could be a piece of jewelry, or it could be
Oh
a
wow.
piece of clothing. It could even be a Bible, something that they invest, that object, they invest something into that links that person to that object. And it almost becomes more than just something that they're keeping, but it becomes a representative of that person in an unhealthy way. Some might even wear that object for years, and hold on to it. And the thing that will let you know that this is unhealthy is that if they lose that object, or if they misplace it, they have a great deal of anxiety and angst about finding it again, and they can almost just fall apart if they misplace it, or they can't find it, or if it's taken away from them even. And that goes over a long period of time. Now, I'm not talking about in the very beginning of the grief, but over a long period of time. It's just something that helps them to maintain that connection in a way that's not always healthy. You know, it's very similar to the child that holds onto a security blanket or
Right.
a pacifier or something like that, that gives them a sense of safety and security. Now, the child will eventually grow up and detach from that object, you know, as they get older. But a grieving person, that this person who has linked that object to the deceased, just won't get over it. And they have to have that object with them all the time. Now, most people have something as a reminder of when a loved one dies. For instance, I'll tell you this. I have my grandmother's cookie jar. And the reason I have that cookie jar, she gave that to me before she passed away, just before she passed away, because I was always raiding the cookie jar. She wanted me to have it. And it's sitting up on my cabinet in the house, and it's very special to me. However, I don't link her to that object so much so that if it were to get broken, it would just break me right along with it. And that's what we're talking about here with linking. I have Afghans that my mother crocheted, and you know, we keep them on display in our house. I have wooden boxes that my dad crafted. He was a woodworker, so he crafted many boxes from wood, and we have some of those in our house too. And those are reminders. And I'm sure you have some reminders of loved ones that have passed on too, right?
Mhm. What about um and I have to share this because it's interesting what you're saying. Uh, I still have my mother's half of my mother's ashes, and also my son's father. And people, sometimes I guess they, instead of being buried, they was cremated.
Yeah.
Um, so I sometimes I wonder if I'm, if something wrong with me just keeping them. But I wanted to one day take them and spread them, but I
Mhm.
also wanted to like put some in a necklace or something, you know, or whatever.
Mhm.
And I don't. A lot of people do that, but I don't know. I'm just
Well, we had a friend who actually did that. She, her, when she passed away, she was cremated, and her children, um, took the ashes and had them put into a necklace. So, and they
right,
distributed that to each one of the grandchildren.
right.
That's not really a case of linking, and there's really nothing wrong with holding on to the person's ashes. Many people have an urn with ashes in their home. That's a fairly normal grief response, but it's really not linking in the sense that we're talking about here.
Uh,
To
yeah,
hang on to.
I, I thought I just asked because some people when they they realize their ashes are here or sitting where in a certain place, they be like,
Mhm.
why will you still have them, or something like that and whatever. But I
Well,
don't.
it's not uncommon to keep ashes for a long period of time. Now, the difference is I have seen people build shrines,
Oh no, no. Mm-mm.
and that's a different kind of a thing in which you almost build up a worshipful center around those ashes. That would be this kind of linking that would be unhealthy.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying and where you're going with.
Yeah.
I wanted to comment about my mother-in-law when all her sisters, let me see, there was 8 girls, and every sister, she was the third from the youngest, but they would take pictures of their loved one in a casket, and she actually framed the picture. I think that's pretty common. I'm from Illinois. That's pretty common in here in Texas that they take pictures of their loved one because my girlfriend did it with her dad and her mom. And I don't know. I just in the beginning I just thought it was kind of weird, but I know that most people who from Texas, that's just the norm. I
Yes.
just I don't understand it, but it's just one of those things that I don't want ever. Can't I don't know. They were old. They were like 80 or
About it as
something.
well, though.
Yes.
Huh?
A lot of people get offended about it as well. Like
Oh,
they feel
really?
I
you're
do.
disrespecting the dead. You know,
Oh,
uh,
wow.
my yeah, I know a lot of family members that done it. My mom did it with my grandmother, and just a lot of people, different people. So yeah, you're right.
Yes. That is something that was more common in the last century than it is in the current day. But it's certainly for people who are now in their 80s and 90s, they, I am sure, remember times when this was happening and happened quite often. Also, it can be some cultures will do that. And that's kind of a cultural thing, depending on the culture of the person that
Personally,
passed away. And also it's not uncommon for different cultures to have different ways of celebrating and
life,
remembering.
right,
So and in that case, Mary taking a picture of the deceased in the casket was a way for them to remember. And that
right.
like would be honoring towards that person.
Like they're celebrating. Like even though they gone, that's their way of accepting the fact that okay, this is the last time they'll be able to see them either being cremated or buried. So they take initiative to take that one last picture.
Yes, yeah. That may be the way they're thinking about that. But that does still happen, certainly, in our society today. Um, when you're working with a person who's going through grief and they're saving objects, um, to to remember this person by. Sometimes it's important to ask them, what its significance is. What's significant about that object? Why do you want to save it? And not to suggest that they get rid of it, but just to make them think. Why is this object something that's important to you? And you may be able to tell from that whether they are linking themselves to that person through that object or not. Is it just something that they like? Is it just a reminder that's going to remind them about their family member, or is there something deeper going on here? You might also ask them, how would you feel if that were lost? If they would feel much anxiety over that, then that could be the beginning of a problem that they need to deal with. You might ask them too how that object will help them or hinder them in their grief process. Will it be something that helps them, or will it be more of a hindrance to them? Ask how long they think this object will be helpful to them. Given a period of time, many of my dad's boxes that he made, we put on display for a while, and now we, kind of relegate them to other places, and some we've given away to our own children and grandchildren and things like that. So it was helpful to us for a time, but it's not something that we had to hold on to link us to that person. And some of those objects provide comfort, and some provide connection. And that may be the difference in someone who is linking themselves to an object. Is it just a comforting thing to us, or is it actually making a connection with that person? Some of the go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking about my mother-in-law. I never had the courage to ask her why she would do that because she did it for all six of her sisters. But
Okay.
I was thinking about my brother when he passed away in Chicago. He always carried a cane, and I took that cane and put it in my suitcase and brought it back to Texas. So
Mhm.
I guess it couldn't be no different than her taking a picture of her sister and me having a cane, because it has no significance other than Tony always carried this cane. So
Right,
I don't think it's something that she's grieving over. It's just a tradition that her family does. You
right,
know, yeah.
right. And the cane for you, I don't sense that that's an object that you are linking your soul to.
Oh no, not at all.
It's just something that gives you remembrance of him.
Right.
And those are the special kinds of things. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. For Cheryl, for instance, there's nothing wrong with saving a blouse
Uh,
or saving some other sentimental thing even that helps you to remember them and to think about them from time to time. It's perfectly normal to do that. For us to close out this evening, I just want to quickly go over some thoughts. We often wonder what makes some people just move through grief so well. They have deep grief and they have sorrow, but they move through it so well and adjust. And others have such a struggle. Why is that? Well, there are some common clues that can be identified that help us to understand why some people uh, grieve within normal limits of grieving and some just can't. There are some things that predispose a person to having difficulty in resolving grief. Um, some of that is caused by people who are always and always have been unable to handle emotional pain. So they resist the process of going through grief because that is a serious emotional pain that they're going to suffer through. So it's a person who's always been unable to handle emotional pain, and now this has been thrust upon them. So it takes them a long time because they resist it. Guilt is another thing that can block healthy grief. While a person reflects on their relationship, if they experience a lot of guilt over their behavior towards the person who has passed away, their feelings, maybe they were angry with them much of the time, or maybe they were really neglectful of the person who passed away. Maybe they would never come to see them and they neglected them for years. Then that can cause a person to grieve in an unhealthy way, or to block the grieving altogether even. So if a person can't adequately confront the guilt that they're feeling, sometimes that will block their grieving process too. Sometimes there may have been an excessive dependence upon the person, a codependence. And they feel that they've really lost not just another person, but they've lost a part of themselves as well. And they just can't get over their grief because they're grieving that part of themselves that they've lost too. Overload can be another reason for not being able to accomplish a healthy grief. When someone experiences a number of losses in a short period of time, Jacqueline, you were talking about that, with so many in your family dying, within a very short period of time. That kind of experience can cause grief to be compounded by grief, to be compounded by another grief, and it almost becomes too much to handle, too heavy a burden to handle all at one time. It's an overload, and that can cause a very, a long grieving process to develop just simply from having so much to bear all at one time. And that's not to say that you won't eventually accomplish a good grieving process, but it is hard. Overload just makes that very difficult. And in a situation like that too, they may have lost some people who could have been a support to them in the loss of other people in their life. So you lose a mother, for instance, and then suddenly within just a week or a month even, you lose sister or brother. Could have been a help to you to grieve the mother, but now they're gone too. So that kind of situation can also lead to an overload of grief, which slows down the healing process. Well, y'all, our time is up for this evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I hope these things have helped you out some as you've gone through this today. We have only one more session. Actually, next week is our last session. And
so I was late.
What's that again?
I say, sorry, I was late.
That's okay. If you wanted to catch up with that, it is recorded and will be on YouTube too. So you can
go back to it.
Look at it there as well.
Yes.
Next
we get some brochures. We get some handouts on this.
I am going to be giving some handouts once the class is over, or possibly I can get them ready to send out this week. some of the information about all of this.
Okay, yes,
So
thank you.
I'll be sending that out too. But thank you all for joining us tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about recovery and just moving on to recovery in grief. And we'll close out this class with that session then. So
Well,
we'll
thank
see you
you.
next week. God bless you all.
God bless
God
you.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.